evening. Once again, let me express my gratitude for all of you coming out this evening as we've come together to worship the Lord in spirit and in truth, and that we have come together to edify one another, and hopefully we have done both of those things tonight, and continue to worship the Lord and give Him praise and honor and glory throughout the week and throughout our lives as well. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 33. Genesis chapter 33. We've been studying through the book of Genesis, and we've been studying through Jacob's life. And Jacob, of course, is, in chapter 32, renamed Israel. And so we start to see, if we're good Bible students, we're starting to see the picture of this nation forming. The nation of Israel comes from Jacob, and thus he is renamed Israel because of what he did, that he wrestled with God, both perhaps literally, although it's not explicitly stated that it was God in the flesh. In fact, it was pointed out to me that in Hosea it says that he wrestled with an angel, and so there's some difficulty surrounding that as to what kind of being this was that took the form of a man, and whether it was God himself or whether an angel. But we understand that in his walk with God, Jacob wrestled with God in the sense that he was constantly seeking the Lord and seeking His blessing, and he was doing so in such a way that he had some growing to do, but he continued to grow and he continued to cling to God, looking for the blessings that were promised. And so we come to chapter 33. We had that kind of interlude where Jacob wrestles with man, but I kind of almost made us forget about, Esau's coming. Esau is coming out to meet Jacob, and Jacob was afraid, and Jacob prayed to God for his protection. So let's talk about that this evening. Genesis 33, let's start reading in verse 1. Then Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. He put the maids and their children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. But he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So the first thing that we want to note is that Jacob is back with his family. You'll remember back in chapter 32, it says that he took them and sent them across the stream, and he also sent across whatever he had, and so he was left alone. But for some reason, he's meeting back up with them. It's kind of surprising to see him with his family. We have to ask, was that always the plan, for him to meet back up with his family before he met Esau, or did plans change? My opinion is that after he wrestled with the man, that he felt assured that God was going to take care of him, and so he decided to meet up with his family. But that's just my opinion. The text does not say so. The next thing that we want to note is Jacob's humility. Here he is out to meet his brother Esau, and when he sees Esau, he leaves his family, he runs to Esau, and that could be seen as a way of trying to protect his family. But as he is going on, he is bowing. And he bows 7 times before Esau. And of course the idea of bowing is showing subservience, showing that you are less than them. Also, it's a way of showing reverence. But 7 is a complete number. And so he's leaving no doubt on where he's placing himself before Esau. By bowing 7 times, he is saying, I am completely and totally less than you and subservient to you. And we don't know how Esau's going to react. In fact, just judging based off of everything that's happened, it would be reasonable to think that Esau has come to kill Jacob, or at least to speak harshly to him. But that's not how Esau comes at all. It says that Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck, which is a idiom for hugging, and kissed him, and they wept. And when we look at the context of everything that is going on, that Esau would not harm Jacob is perhaps predictable, because we understand that Jacob is under God's protection, and Jacob has prayed for God's protection. And so someone reading this for the first time might say, well, I bet you God's going to protect Jacob, and Esau's not going to harm him. However, Esau does far more than not kill Jacob. He embraces him, and he hugs him, and he kisses, and he weeps. This is showing love for his brother and joy in being reunited with him. And that is surprising. And perhaps, the text does not say, but perhaps God had a hand in that as well, that Esau's heart was softened before his brother. Let's continue reading in verse 5. Chapter 33, verse 5. He lifted his eyes and saw the women and the children and said, "Who are these with you?" So he said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the maids came near with their children, and they bowed down. Leah likewise came near with her children, and they bowed down. And afterward Joseph came near with Rachel, and they bowed down. And he said, "What do you mean by all this company which I have met?" And he said, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have plenty, my brother. Let what you have be your own." Jacob said, "No, please, if now I have found favor in your sight, then take my present from my hand. For I see your face as one sees the face of God, and you have received me favorably. Please take my gift which has been brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have plenty." Thus he urged him, and he took it. So again, we want to note not only Jacob's humility, but also his family's humility. Esau sees all these women and children before Jacob, and he's asked, "Who are these people?" Jacob introduces them, and note his words that he gives God the glory for his family growing. God has given these things to him. But he also reiterates that he is Esau's servant. And Jacob is showing total humility here before his brother. And Jacob's family also shows humility. They go up before Esau, and they bow before him, greeting in an honorable way, and probably according to the customs of the day. And so they are showing humility. They are not ruffling Esau's feathers in any way. They are completely humble before him. And then Esau asks another question. He says, "What do you mean by all this company which I met?" And we recall back in chapter 32 that Jacob had sent on multiple servants who had multiple, hundreds of camels and donkeys as gifts to try to appease Esau. And so Esau is asking, what's that all about? And Jacob says, to find favor in the sight of his Lord. And perhaps Esau should have already known this. The servants would have said as much, but he's looking for confirmation from Jacob, wanted to hear it from his own mouth. But then Esau says he has plenty, and that Jacob should keep what he has. Now, you can see this two ways. You can see this as Esau kind of asserting his dominance in a way of, well, I don't need your stuff, Or, what I tend to think is that Esau's saying that he's not acting based upon Jacob's gifts. That's not why he's treating Jacob so kindly. But something that we note is that Jacob is, at this point, has no fear of Esau harming him, at least not a realistic one. Esau has greeted him warmly, but he still wants to give these gifts to his brother. Perhaps this is a way of making up for past mistakes, past things that he's done to Esau. Or perhaps that he is just being generous. Whatever the case is, I think we can learn from Jacob in this, that generosity should not be contingent on something being in it for us. Here he gives to Esau even though he fears no harm from Esau, but he gives anyway. Continue reading with me in verse 12. Then Esau said, "Let us take our journey and go, and I will go before you." But he said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they are driven hard one day, all the flocks will die. Please let my Lord pass on before his servant, and I will proceed at my leisure, according to the pace of the cattle that are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord at Seir." Esau said, "Please let me leave with you some of the people who are with me." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. So Esau has a proposal for Jacob. He proposes to escort Jacob's people, his family and his servants and his cattle, through the land. And that's a generous offer. The journey through this land could have been dangerous for Jacob, considering how many people and how many animals he was bringing with him. He could have faced a raid or an attack from multiple people, perhaps even armies from cities. And Esau is saying, let me and my 400 men protect you. But Jacob doesn't want that. And we have to ask, why? He lets Esau go back home and even denies that having some of Esau's men escort him. Why is that? Well, for one, I think that Jacob does not want to press his luck. While he and Esau are on good terms, at least seemingly at this point, they are very different people with different priorities, and they have a history with one another. And more time together could bring strain on that relationship. Secondly, and this is one that I favor a little bit more than the first, is that Jacob trusts in God to keep him safe on this journey. Denying protection from Esau is a way of showing faith in God. Remember, he's prayed to God for protection when he left Laban, and now when he's coming to meet Esau, and so he continues to trust in God that God is going to protect him on his way back home. Finally, in this section, we want to note what Jacob's plans seem to be. He states that he plans to meet Esau at Seir, the place where Esau is living. We would know this to become Edom. That's where Esau set up and established the kingdom, the nation of Edom. And the text somewhat indicates that he was going to meet him there as soon as possible, but judging from the rest of the text, that doesn't seem to be the case based on the rest of the text. And let's read the rest of the text, starting in verse 17. Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built for himself a house and made booths for his livestock. And there the place is named Succoth. Now Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Paddan Aram and camped before the city. He bought the piece of land where he had pitched his tent from the hand of the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Then he erected there an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. So we talked about Jacob's plans, that maybe if we were just to read what he says in this first section, the section of 12 through 16, maybe we think, oh, he's going to meet Esau at Seir as he passes through the land. He's going to meet him right away, as soon as possible. But based on what he does, I don't think that's the meaning that we should take. Again, Jacob could have been lying. I'll acknowledge that as a possibility, but that doesn't seem to fit with his character now. Fit with the way he was, but not really the way he is now. And so, I take this to mean, yeah, you go back home, Esau, and then when I'm all good and settled, when I travel through the land, then I'll come visit you at some point. That's the way that I take it. And so he journeys to Succoth, and he builds himself a house, and he stays there for a time. But then he eventually makes his way to Shechem and camps before the city. He bought a piece of land there. And so we notice that he's in Shechem now. Now Shechem will be in Jacob's home until he and his family move to Egypt. And moving forward, we're going to see how living here negatively affects Jacob and his family. This is not the place to live for them. At least it seems to be so based on what happens. But for a time, he stays in Shechem, and it negatively affects him and his family. The final thing that we want to note from this text is that Jacob builds an altar. And El Elohe Israel is its name, which means God, the God of Israel. Well, one thing that we can note from that is that Jacob is acknowledging his new name, right? That Jacob's name, back in chapter 32, was changed to Israel. And so he's acknowledging what God has called him. But he's also making good on a promise. Do you remember that promise? It's been a few weeks since we talked about that promise. But for Jacob, it had been 20 plus years, I believe, since he made that promise. Turn with me back to Genesis chapter 28. It will also be up here on the screen. But Genesis chapter 28, verse 20 and 21. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me, and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. This is Jacob as he's preparing to go to Paddan Aram, to be with his mother's people, running away from Esau. And so we see things come full circle. That Jacob has gone. God has protected him. He goes to Laban's house. He finds wives and children and grows in both his family and in his wealth. God protected him and made him grow while in Laban's house. And then he comes back. And Esau does not try to harm him as he goes back to his land. God has protected him. God was with him. God kept him on the journey that he took. He gave him food to eat, garments to wear, and he returned to his father's house in safety. So God held up his end of the bargain, the promise, the vow, and Jacob upholds his. He says, if all these things happen, then the Lord will be my God. Notice what the altar is called. God, the God of Israel. God is his God. And he acknowledges that. As we close this evening, we see how Jacob has kept his commitment to the Lord. He made a vow. And though many years pass between the keeping of it, he acknowledges it and he intends to pay. That's what that altar means. Now, of course, he needs to pay for the rest of his life, but we know the rest of the story. He does. God is his God for the rest of his life. And that's a stark reminder to us, I think, that we have commitments to keep as well. Again, I've said this multiple times from the pulpit, but I know that I'm talking to a mostly Christian audience, mostly people who have obeyed the gospel. And we understand that when we obey the gospel, we are making a lifetime commitment to Christ. We are giving up ourselves, denying ourselves, and we are taking up our cross, and we're following Jesus. And so, I would use Jacob's example to exhort you, to remind you of the commitment that you made to God, and urge you to keep it. This evening, maybe you're not a Christian. Maybe you want to make that commitment. It is a difficult commitment. It does have hardship. Taking up your cross and following Jesus means denying yourself, means perhaps giving up your life. In fact, yes, it does mean losing your life for His sake. But it is a commitment worth making. If you believe in Jesus, that He is the Son of God, and if you want to repent of your sins and turn away from a life of sin and turn toward a life of righteousness, if you're willing to confess Jesus is the Christ before men, if you're willing to be baptized for the remission of sins, then we can help you with that. If you are a Christian, perhaps you have not been living up to your commitment, you can make that right as well. If you have any need this evening, won't you come while we stand and sing?